So after numerous suggestions, I sat down and read Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order: Why Nations Succeed and Fail by Ray Dalio. And it's not good, folks. There's some interesting economic ideas presented here, but it's a mess of a book, and the history that's presented is often wrong. Let me start by saying I've been impressed and intimidated by Ray Dalio for decades. Back around the turn of the century, I trained as a stockbroker, and one of the reasons I decided not to take up the career was my certainty that I would never be able to compete with folks like Dalio, who founded Bridgewater Associates, which is often described as the world's largest hedge fund. There are thousands of people who get big market moves right once. People make movies about them, even if they never get anything right again, because timing the market right once is an impressive thing to do. But there's a much smaller class of people who consistently beat the market year after year, decade after decade, and Ray Dalio is one of them. The guy is a genius, which is why I found his book on world order so frustrating. There are some interesting bits to it, but on balance at this point, I think the project is a failure. He may be a financial genius, but when it comes to history and the world order, his models just fail. They don't describe what has happened, and they do not describe what is to come. My understanding of what makes Ray Dalio great is that he's a systematizer. He essentially built a pile of algorithms for the trading of financial securities. If X happens, then the price of an asset is likely to do Y. Through innovative management practices and deeper research into historical price data than anybody else was willing to do, Dalio built an organization that consistently did a better job predicting the prices of financial securities than anybody else. And this is, I think, the fundamental problem with this book. Ray Dalio figured out a system that allowed him to predict the prices of financial securities better than anybody else, and it made him almost impossibly wealthy. So he thinks he can come up with a similarly straightforward system for predicting global order, but he can't, because global order has a concrete reality in ways that financial securities simply do not. Stocks, bonds, futures, the most complex financial derivatives we can imagine, these are all made-up things. They are human inventions, cooked up to model the real world, but they are not the real world. A global order made up of human societies is also invented to a degree, but it has an irreducible weight and complexity that you simply can't boil down to numbers. Actually, that's kind of what financial securities are in the aggregate. They are an attempt to model reality. But every security, no matter how complex, boils down to a simple metric, a number that goes up or down and that you can attempt to predict. Global order will never boil down to mere numbers like a stock or a bond. Let's do a metaphor here. The world order is the National Basketball Association. It's the personalities, talents, recruiting strategies, financial pictures, training regimens, and interpersonal interactions of every player, coach, and bureaucrat in the league. Financial securities are the points scored in a single week of games. It's useful data, but it isn't going to tell you which team is going to be sold or go bankrupt this year. Hell, a single week's worth of scores won't even tell you who will win the national championship. There's simply too many factors involved. You aren't going to be able to boil global order down to simple, quantifiable mechanics. But Ray Dalio is a finance guy, so he tries to do it.
Typically, the decline comes gradually and then very suddenly. When debts become very large and there is an economic downturn and the empire can no longer borrow the money necessary to repay its debts, the financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money.
Now, I am not one of those people who will tell you that the country's finances aren't important. They are. The monstrous US debt matters a lot. Or it will, as soon as we have a rival with finances that aren't even more nightmarish than our own. But we don't live in that world yet, and we still have time to fix the problem. Dalio suggests that we are in the final throes of what he calls the big cycle of money, credit, debt, and economic activity. That's very possible, but the more of his book I read, the less that seemed seem to mean. Dalio suggests that these big debt cycles last about 75 years, and that our cycle must be nearing its end. Dalio states that our current big debt cycle began with the establishment of the Bretton Woods dollar-gold standard in the late 1940s. In his model, the devaluation of currency is a clear sign of catastrophic decline. But the current U.S. big debt cycle experienced a massive currency devaluation with Nixon back in 1971, over 50 years ago. So the fall of the Soviet Union, the entire period of unchallenged U.S. hyperpower, the internet, cell phones, the go-go 80s and 90s, ongoing U.S. military supremacy from Libya to Taiwan to Ukraine, that's all U.S. decline? I mean, sure, I guess I can buy that my entire lifetime, with all of its outsized U.S. successes and failures, has really just been a phase of post-gold standard decadence on the way to the fall. I can be pessimistic sometimes too, but an explanatory model where the decline period is twice as long as the good bits has essentially no predictive value. I guess the crisis could come tomorrow, or it could be another 50 years. What this debt cycle theory really is gussied up old school Wall Street prejudice. It's gold buggery, the idea that money is worthless unless it's based on a metal. Dalio isn't a fanatic. He's careful to point out that paper money can be useful before it's dangerous, but the book's central theory is just a fancier version of the guys trying to sell you gold coins in between Tucker Carlson segments on Fox News. Again, I'm not saying that Ray Dalio or the Bitcoin bros are wrong about the dangers of currency devaluation and inflation, just that they've been wrong about it for 50 years now. Dalio's book has gotten a ton of love on TikTok among crypto fans who have made gold bug or sound money theories central to their ideology over the past 18 months or so. Dalio and the crypto bros are very right to point out that post-COVID money printing by the Federal Reserve is an unnerving experiment. But it's not a new experiment. We've been doing it since 2013. It's been running for almost a decade now, and we are all still here. Every crisis still causes a flight to the dollar. It ain't fair, and it may not make any sense, but it's what keeps happening for 50 years now. Dalio's big debt crisis model might be timeless and universal, as he endlessly keeps telling us, but it doesn't have much predictive value because it doesn't tell us anything about timing. So I find the financial aspects of this book deeply unpersuasive, but if that were my only problem with it, I would tell you to ignore this rando on YouTube and go with what one of history's most successful investors is trying to tell you. But the problems only start with the financial model. For one thing, this book on global order doesn't appear to have a working definition of what global order is or where it started. I will lay those out for you right now. World order started in the 1760s, and it was started by the British Empire. There have been tons of impressive empires in world history, but before the British in the 1760s, there was no global order. What global order is a world system where everybody is compelled to follow the same set of basic rules if they want to participate economically or even survive as nation states. Global order might be possible without one country in charge calling all the shots, but we haven't seen it on this planet yet. The Romans, the Persians, the Mongols, the Habsburgs, and some Chinese dynasties were very impressive, but they never controlled the whole world, or even knew what most of it looked like. There have only been two real world empires in human history, the British Empire and the US Empire. Comparing these two empires to each other makes sense. Comparing them to any other empires is nonsense. This book is suffused with a maddening lack of precision. Ray Dalio aspires to be a philosopher, and he really wants his cycles to apply everywhere, to everyone, at every level. Everything is timeless and universal, timeless and universal. History shows that when an individual, organization, country, or empire spends more than what they earn, misery and turbulence are ahead. Well, if I ran my finances the way that the federal government does, I'd be in prison for fraud. We are taught to mock conservative talk radio when it implies that personal finances and governmental finances are somehow the same thing. we should also mock billionaire investors when they put forward similar ideas. And this book is just full of them. It may not be philosophically satisfying to point this out, but the truth is that my bank account is a very different thing from the Federal Reserve. And the ability of a Roman centurion or a Dutch pirate to stab a peasant outside of a border fort is very different from a London or New York banker being able to destroy the currency of any country in the world over the course of a long lunch. The ability to destroy a country over lunch is what global order is, and it's a very, very new development in human history. Ray Dalio's book refuses to reckon with any of this, and the book massively distorts history to pretend that anything it describes is timeless and universal. I want to reproduce this page here because I'm not entirely certain what he's saying. You can pause it to read it yourself, but my sense is that he's implying that ancient Rome and Greece fell because their central banks didn't manage their interest rates well. Central banks are not timeless and universal. In almost all countries, they are less than 150 years old. And in the handful of countries where the institutions are older than that, they were completely different animals before the 20th century. Dalio claims in his introduction to be writing in common sense language so he can reach a lot of people, but the writing often didn't make any sense at all. Eras, countries, and personal anecdotes are jumbled together with absurdly grand claims for timelessness and universality that are never backed up. The very definition of words seems to be up in the air in ways that weren't at all helpful. There is a reason people use precise, careful language to describe important things. This book isn't simple and straightforward, it's careless and messy. Amazingly, if you make it to pages 388 to 391 of the book, the authors admit that their big, timeless, universal cycle models are useless. Their deep research into 1,000+ years worth of Chinese empires doesn't fit into any of their models because global reserve currencies didn't exist until we had a global order, and inflation wasn't a factor in China until the 20th century. Despite what's advertised in the promotional material and video, however, a deep history of Chinese dynasties and the other European empires don't really feature much in the book. The history of the Dutch Empire does feature prominently, however, and it's almost entirely wrong.
Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the four most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them.
Dalio has a big cycle model based, I believe, on the British Empire and nothing else that he wants to cram the Dutch Empire into. To do this, he systematically distorts Dutch Empire history. The Dutch were very impressive. They did have global reach, and they absolutely did come up with many of the financial innovations the British Empire used to create the first global system. But to the great empires of Asia, the Dutch were barely an annoyance, if they were noticed at all. The British invaded and destroyed both China and India in the 1800s. The Dutch had to beg for the right to buy things from those empires at the height of Dutch power in the 1600s. The Dutch did not participate in, let alone lead, a modern global order.
In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing.
There was no dominant period of peace and prosperity for the Dutch Empire. To make his models work, Dalio pretends that the Dutch Golden Age lasted almost 150 years longer than it actually did. In a bit of bad editing, this graph of Dutch power on page 267 includes the 1672 year of disaster for the Dutch, even though it never comes up in the text. Dalio's models are all about finance, so he ludicrously claims that the Dutch were a bigger power than the British through most of the 1700s until a bank default in the 1780s took the Dutch Republic out. Well, as a New Yorker rather than a New Amsterdamer, I'm here to tell you that that sequence of events is simply not true. The British took New York and a whole bunch of other things away from the Dutch in the 1660s, not the 1760s. For the first half of the 1600s, the tiny Dutch Republic really did punch far above its weight class. They used stolen wealth from Asia to exert real power in Europe. But it was war that allowed them to do this, not peace. The French, Spanish, British, and Germans were too busy tearing each other apart to focus on the Dutch. The end of the 30 Years' War in 1648 wasn't the beginning of the Dutch Golden Age, the way Dalio claims. It was the end. After 1648, the British and French were now free to focus on ripping away all of the wealth, innovations, and territory the Dutch had created. In 1672, the Year of Disaster, an English, French, and German coalition completely overran the country. The loss was so bad that a Dutch mob killed and partially ate the politicians responsible. I think what has confused Dalio's researchers here is that Wikipedia lists most of the many wars of the second half of the 1600s as Dutch victories. They were victories. The Dutch even managed to come back from the Year of Disaster in 1672 and kick everyone off their territory. But these were victories like Vietnam's in 1975. Yes, the Dutch won by simply surviving. This didn't mean they were still a great power. Vietnam didn't win in Saigon and then jump into a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. By the end of the 1600s, after being repeatedly ripped to shreds, the Dutch figured out a strategy. They gave England a king and made themselves useful in the British rivalry with France for most of the next century. It was only under the wing of British protection that the Dutch Republic was allowed to peacefully stagnate. It was the catastrophic decision to turn on their British patrons in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, a century after the first three, that resulted in the debt default and annexation by France that Ray Dalio seems to see as the first indications of decline. This Dutch move in the 1780s would be roughly analogous to the British deciding to attack the United States today. It wouldn't work out very well. This distortion of Dutch history also highlights a fundamental problem with Ray Dalio's focus on financial issues. The Dutch guilder remained an important currency for a full century after the destruction of Dutch power. On page 320 of his book, Dalio comes right out and says that it took 20 years for the British to lose reserve currency status after losing power to the United States. I would argue it was more like 50 years actually, because I date the end of the British Empire to the spring of 1917. When the United States had to come in and save Britain from a debt default by jumping into World War I. But I think Ray Dalio is probably a little more with historical consensus to put the end of the British Empire at like 1945. Regardless, Ray Dalio concedes in his book, intentionally or not, that financial doom is a lagging indicator of imperial decline, not a leading one. Financial ruin comes after the geopolitical catastrophe, not before. So the true, unacknowledged message of this book, for all those gold bugs and Bitcoiners hoping for the cataclysmic fall of the dollar, is that we probably have to do World War III before that happens. I don't consider myself an expert on the Dutch Empire. Don't speak the language, but I do consider myself an expert on the British Empire. And I have to say that Ray Dalio's coverage of the British Empire is pretty okay, actually. The world that Ray Dalio inhabits is the world that the British Empire built. Since the end of the 7 Years' War in 1764, we have had a global order where banking and finance are just as powerful as any gunboat. As I said before, there have only been two true world empires, the United Kingdom and the United States, and more people should do the work of comparing them. I found the statistics and financial history assembled in Ray Dalio's 40-page chapter on the British Empire to be pretty helpful, and I will probably revisit it in the future, unlike the rest of the book. The big cycle model that Dalio talks about also happens to work really well for the British Empire. I suspect because it's the example that the model was drawn from. Don't get me wrong, the book has plenty of glaring errors when it comes to the British Empire as well. The one that bugged me the most was probably on page 163, where he describes the peaceful and prosperous foreign policy of British Prime Minister William Gladstone. Gladstone is a nicer figure than more bloodthirsty Victorians like Disraeli or Lord Salisbury or Lord Palmerston, but he was still the guy who launched Europe's scramble to conquer Africa, one of history's greatest crimes. Oh, and on the next page, Dalio talks about how much the 1960s US President Kennedy loved peace, despite that whole closest the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation thing. So I'm not saying that the coverage of the British Empire is great, I'm just saying it's better than anything else in the book. In his introduction, Ray Dalio mentions that he intends his study of global order to be an iterative process. Well, I'd like to suggest that the next iteration should really just dive in further on the British Empire. There are no timeless and universal cycles when it comes to global order. But history has been kind enough to provide us with a sample size of two truly global empires, the US and the British. I believe Ray Dalio should use his vast resources to focus on studying them. And if Ray Dalio, or you, want a good place to start on that, my book, Avoiding the British Empire, which compares the US and British world systems much more seriously, is a good option. Thank you.